So the snapping tools in XSI are very, very powerful and flexible, but very, very easy to use. So I'll quickly just run you through some of the functionality and some of the options that we have. So snapping, you'll find all of the options actually here. Snap, there's a menu with all of your snap options and functionality, and these 5 buttons down here, the use of which I'll explain as we go on. To turn snapping on, you simply activate it here. This is the toggle button to turn on off, or for a keyboard shortcut, just hold down Control key and that will toggle it temporarily. So while Control is pressed, you actually have snapping activated. So let's just do a little bit of snapping here. There we go. Let's just select some points. And now, obviously, if I just start moving them, it's not really going to snap to anything because I don't actually have a target selected. It needs to snap to something. And that's what these guys here are for. And these define what the targets will be that I will snap to. And in this case, I'm just going to activate Grid Reference Plane. So it's now going to, as I move the axis, snap to the grid, the floor grid in this case. You can actually change the size and the outlet layout of the floor grid if you want to, if it's too coarse or too fine. If you go to the eye icon here and visibility options, under visual cues, you'll find floor grid setup. Here you have the cell size for the floor and the snap size. So we could set this, for example, to 2.2 and set this to 0.5, 0.5. So now actually I'll have exactly the same result as I had before, in that it's snapping in the same distance, but the grid is now a little bit coarser. And of course you can make it finer or change the snapping increments however you want. So, grid, fairly straightforward. One other thing to mention about the grid is if you have a reference plane, this will also control the snapping to the reference plane. Also, if I'm actually in view mode, you'll find that it will superimpose a grid into your viewport in the view plane, thus allowing you to snap to that. So let's go on to the next option, which would be points. Now, points could be pretty much any point in space, whether that's a particle, whether that's a point on a NURBS curve, whether that's a point on a polygonal subdivision surface, or whether it's a point on a NURBS surface. Can be pretty much any point or vertex. So I'm going to actually grab this curve that I have here, and we'll just snap some points to that curve, just for demonstration purposes here. So I'm just going to grab this set of points and activate my cursor. And you see, as the minute my cursor is activated, it starts showing me these points. And this is the available targets for my snapping. So even though the curve is not selected, it's showing me what I can snap to. So I just simply grab the points and move them up. And the minute the point is inside this box around my cursor, you can see it says point down below, so what it is snapping to, and it immediately snaps to the closest point to the cursor. There we go. So you'll notice that it's snapping all of the points together onto that one point. So it's taking all of my selected points and collapsing them together onto one. Now, this behavior can be changed. Under the transform menu, you'll find collapse points for snapping absolute translation. So if I unselect that, what you'll find is that it's now taking the midpoint and it's just snapping the midpoint of all of these points, keeping the formation and the distance of the points to each other stable. Now, one common thing is I'd like to actually define which point I would like to snap or to be used for the snapping. That I can do, remember, by just moving the pivot with the Alt button. So if I hold down Alt and move the pivot to a given point or midpoint, it will now use that point to actually use for the snapping origin. There we go. So, points, quite straightforward. Knots, quite straightforward, just NURBS knots, whether that be on a NURBS curve or on a NURBS surface. It's actually directly on the surface or directly on the curve. We also have centers, that would be the center of an object, and you can see up there, for example, this null, I can just snap to the center of the null quite quickly. Again, useful for aligning objects especially. And finally, midpoints. Midpoints is just the point in between 2 points, and what you'll see here is that it's actually snapping in between 2 points on this grid, but it's snapping to itself. Now, that's a behavior that can be useful, but could also be very obstructive, and so we have an option to turn that off. Snap to unselected objects only. If I turn that on, you'll find that it no longer snaps to itself, simply because it's a selected object, so it cannot snap to itself. So let's turn that off. Okay. Next we have curves. Now curves, we have several options: edges, UVs, boundaries, etc. All fairly self-explanatory. So I'll just grab a curve and turn that on. And what we can see now is that it snaps with the curve. Now the interesting thing about this is that it's smooth. It'll snap to any given point on a curve. It's not defined by the actual NURBS points. So it's a smooth snapping, which can be very, very useful for, especially for animation, if you want to define something and snap to that curve ahead of time. So edges, obviously the edges of an object, UVs on a NURBS surface, and of course boundaries. So for example, the boundary surface of a boundary curve of a trim, for example, something like that. Now, next we have surfaces themselves. Now, if I just grab this this null, and I wish to snap it down, you'll find that it actually snaps to individual facets of faces if I have them turned on. I didn't actually have to turn them on. There they go. And it's now snapping to every every polygon face that I have on this polygonal grid here. Now, you'll find it says face underneath. Now, what's actually interesting is if I now just hide this one and bring out a NURBS grid. Oops, there we go. You'll find that now I can switch this to surfaces, turn off faces, and it will now smoothly adhere to the NURBS surface regardless of where I put it. So again, very, very useful for aligning objects, positioning them, also for animating. So that's pretty much our targets. We do have a couple other functionality options in the snap menu itself that are fairly useful. So let's just go over them, and I'll just grab here a cube, polygon cube. And one of the really useful things here is that not only do we have the target definition, but we also have some target filters. So like we saw, points could actually mean, if I now move this, points could be, let's go into select that, there we go. Points could be a point on a NURBS surface, or on a polygon surface, or on a curve. So you see a lot of different things are possible, and that gets quite confusing, especially with dense objects, dense geometry. It can get fairly difficult if you have a lot of objects. So what we can do is we can filter out what exactly we'd like to be snapping to as well. So for example, let's just say polygon meshes. Now it will only snap to the polygon meshes. I can also do multiple selections, so I could say polygon meshes and NURBS curves. So now I have both of those selected, available for my snapping. So again, these filters are very, very useful and come in very, very handy. You see that my region size is defined. It's this box around the cursor where the snapping will start. So as long as it's outside, it's not snapping. The minute it enters, it snaps. Now, I have it set very large just for visibility's sake, but if you're working with complex geometry or a lot of objects, it could be a little bit too much. So you can set your region size down lower or even none. So just simply down to 50. You can see now the box is smaller, just makes it a little bit that much easier to handle and a little bit finer. Then you can have it snapping the closest segments, snapping to, we saw this snapping to unselected objects only, and snapping to the visible grid that we have here in the camera views. All of those options are fairly much self-explanatory, so I'll just let you play around with them, and I encourage you to try them out and see for yourself how they work. So that pretty much covers all of the direct snapping options. Now there is one other form of snapping that is very, very useful, which is our increment snapping. Now if I just grab this null here and sort of bring him into view a little bit, there. Now what we have is increment snapping, and you'll find the actual setup under the transform panel, under transform preferences and increments. Now what this allows you to do is actually, for example, during a rotation, hold down the shift key, and it will now snap to these increments that you've defined here. So for example, every 15 degrees. Okay. If I wish to translate and I hold down the snapping, it will now snap every 1 unit. So again, even though the snapping itself is not activated, this allows you to define set increments for your actual manipulation, which just makes it that much easier to handle.